As you may know, Susanna and I are expecting a baby in 7 weeks' time, and it's quite obvious now. One of the things I'm really looking forward to, but also slightly dreading, is telling stories or reading stories. I look forward to cuddling up on the armchair, baby on my lap, reading them a story, seeing their eyes light up at the pictures, or me doing the funny voices, whatever it might be. I look forward to that. What I don't look forward to is reading the same story over and over and over again. And if you're a parent, or if you've ever read stories to children, they don't really get bored, do they? And whether it's playing the same game over and over and over again. We saw some friends recently who have a 2-year-old, and I made up a game with him, and then he wanted to play it for the next half an hour, and in the end I had to walk away because it just became too annoying. Sometimes stories in the Bible are ones we've heard over and over and over again. Daniel chapter 6 possibly might be one of the most famous stories in the Bible. Daniel in the lion's den. Many, many people have heard this story. Over the years, it's been a story that's been put in children's books, stories that are taught to children in Sunday schools. And when you think about it, it's quite a graphic story to put in a children's book or to teach to children. Not that there aren't things children might learn from it. And perhaps we're here today and we've just listened to Daniel 6. It's been left on a cliffhanger and we say, well, I know what happens next. I know this story. I've heard it so many times. Daniel prays, he's chucked in a lion's den, God saves him, and he's taken out. Is there any more to it than that? When we read these stories in the Bible, we need to come to them knowing that they're not made up stories for children. They're not trivial at all. They are true stories from history that teach us so much. And as we look at this story together, very familiar words, let's approach it with fresh eyes, with a fresh heart, to see what God has to say to us through it. I think it has a lot to say to us. It talks about persecution. It talks about having integrity, standing firm in faith, and ultimately God's miraculous deliverance. Just to take us back briefly to the end of chapter 5, we see that King Belshazzar was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. He's the third king we find in this book of Daniel. And remember, at this point, the people of Israel are in exile. They're in Babylon. They're not home. And Darius, as we see at the beginning of chapter 6, appoints 120 satraps, which is a strange word, but it essentially means governors. And they are to rule throughout the kingdom with 3 ministers over them, and one of these ministers is Daniel. Not only this, but Daniel has such great qualities that the king, Darius, plans to set him over the whole kingdom. Things were going well for Daniel at this point. He's highly favored by the king. He's been put in a very high office, and in fact, there's plans to make him even more higher in the kingdom. Things were going well. But this made, as we've just seen in the story, it made people jealous. Incredibly jealous, actually. So jealous that they come up with this plan to basically get rid of Daniel. So they tried to find something against him. They tried to find some rule or some law that he's broken. But they find nothing. They find that actually he's trustworthy. There's no corruption in him. Daniel had integrity. in the way he worked. He had integrity professionally. And I think this is a good thing for us to see, that the way he worked was with integrity. It's a really important thing. It's important that we, as we maybe work now, or maybe many of us are out of work, but perhaps in the way we conduct ourselves in society or in the places we go, but actually we have integrity. We live within the laws of the world, of the town. It's a really important thing. Because when these people try to catch Daniel out, they look at his life, they look at the way he works, the way he lives, and they say, well, actually, there's nothing we can use against him. Wouldn't it be wonderful if someone tried to catch us out and they looked at our life and they said, actually, there's nothing I can use against this person. The way in which they live, the way they work is fine. They've not broken any rules. They've not broken any laws. So they fail in finding anything at fault in Daniel. So rather than finding a law that he's broken, they choose, I think, to attack his faith. He's done nothing wrong. He's not broken any rules. He's not worked unprofessionally. So they attack his faith. One of the things that Daniel did every day, 3 times a day, was pray. He'd get down on his knees, face Jerusalem, and would give thanks to God. He'd spend time in prayer to him. This is something they tried to use against Daniel. Have a look at verse 7. So these ministers, satraps, it says that they all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce a decree that anyone who prays to any god or any human during the next 30 days, except the king, should be thrown into the lion's den. And a decree that's in writing that cannot be altered, cannot be repealed. And so, Darius puts this decree in place. I wonder how we might have expected Daniel to respond when he saw this. When he finds out about this decree, he continues praying. 3 times a day, facing Jerusalem just as he did before. He didn't stop. How might we have responded if we were in Daniel's shoes? Imagine the scenario tomorrow morning. You wake up, you turn the TV on, and the headline says, it's illegal to pray in the UK. And if you're caught praying, you're put in prison. Or maybe even worse, you're put to death. What would you do? I think, if I'm honest, I'd be incredibly scared. I guess we don't really know how we would respond until we're actually in that situation. We are incredibly blessed and thankful to be in a country where that is not the case. But in many countries, it is the case that people have to pray in secret, meet in secret. And there's some in our number here who perhaps know that personally. But Daniel has courage. Daniel stays faithful to his God, even at the threat of death. Daniel has this kind of spiritual routine, you might call it. He gets up in the morning, he prays. He has his lunch, he prays. He goes to bed, he prays. And he didn't stop. It was his way that he would connect with his God in prayer, and he did not give up. He remained faithful despite the threat of the lion's den. But as you know this story, as it goes on, Daniel's caught. And you think maybe he wanted to be caught, because it says in the verses, he opened up his windows and prayed towards Jerusalem. He didn't kind of go into a dark room, put the blinds down and hide and whisper a little prayer. He was very open. He may as well have just stood out on the outside the building and just prayed where he was. He has such courage that he's found out and he's thrown into the lion's den, which is where our reading ended. Now you may have noticed, and I'll point you to it, what Darius is like in this situation. It says in verse 14, when he finds out about Daniel who's been praying, it says, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sunset to save him. As Daniel is thrown into the den, he says, "May your God, whom you serve, continually rescue you." This king who'd made this decree was greatly distressed because I think he just knew it wasn't right. But he was bound by this law that he'd kind of had his arm twisted to make. And he hopes that Daniel can be saved by his God, and a stone is placed over the den. Daniel is faithful to God in not giving up praying, even at the threat of death. Daniel has courage to keep going, keep trusting in God. It's an amazing thing to see in Daniel, his faithfulness. And his faithfulness meant being thrown into the den. As you know, the story does not finish there. The next morning, the king, who by the way has not slept or eaten ever since Daniel was thrown in, he runs out to the tomb, to the den. And he says, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to rescue you from the lions?" And perhaps he was expecting to hear nothing. But Daniel answered, "May the king live forever." That's a small k for Darius. "My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." The king was overjoyed. Daniel is lifted out of the den. No wound is found on him. And we're told that is because he had trusted in his God. And then there's another command from the king, that those who would falsely accuse Daniel, those who had gone against him, those who would basically lied and coerced the king, they are the ones that are thrown to the lions, with their families as well. And for them, the lions overpower, and their bones are crushed. Daniel trusted in God and was not harmed, even though he was thrown to the lions. He was lifted up, lifted from the den. And those who had opposed him, those who ultimately had opposed God, their fate was different. Just want to spend a moment thinking about the lion's den. Because today we're not threatened with a lion's den, literally. But our lion's den might look like something different. Perhaps it's the pressure to compromise our faith, to compromise the things we know to be true, the things that society tells us are true, but actually goes against what we know to be true. Maybe we feel the pressure to give in. Maybe you face ridicule for your faith. Maybe from your family, from your friends, in your workplace, wherever it might be. Perhaps our lion's den might be temptation to sin. It might be personal struggles with addiction. It might be doubts, things that are pulling us away from our relationship with God. Perhaps your lion's den is loneliness in your faith. Perhaps you became a Christian recently or when you were younger, and you're the only person in your family who trusts in Jesus. Or maybe the only person in a friendship group you're in. And you face ridicule or rejection. You feel alone. Maybe your lion's den is suffering, pain. Maybe it's loss. Trying to trust in God's goodness, in God's plan, even when things just don't make any sense. Having faith in God in Daniel's day was hard. And it is the same today. I don't think it's going to get any easier to be a Christian in the world. And I think the Bible is really clear in kind of preparing us for that. In 1 Peter, Christians are described as exiles. I guess it's a bit like being in a different country where no one speaks English or your language. It's uncomfortable, it's scary, it can be very lonely. What about living in a world where no one speaks Jesus? We're going to find that hard. Jesus' own words in Matthew chapter 5, he says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." As we seek to live out our faith and live for Jesus and try to make him known in this world, we will find persecution. And perhaps you're here and you say, well, I've not really found that yet. I think Jesus' words tell us that it will happen. Trials will come. But just as Daniel gives us his example of someone who trusted in God, despite the trials he knew he would face, God calls us to be faithful to him, even when it feels impossible to be. Because he is a sovereign God, sovereign over all kings, all powers, all lions, and he is in control of it all. And the chapter ends with King Darius issuing another decree, which is very different to the first one he gave. He says in verse 26, "In every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." These words, I think, speak of hope. A living God who endures forever, whose kingdom will never be destroyed, will never end. This God who rescues. He's seen this firsthand in Daniel. This means there is hope for us too. As we perhaps feel we're deep in the den right now, there is hope. This is a story, I guess, really about Daniel and God. Daniel's faithful witness and God's deliverance. But actually, it has a much wider effect than just Daniel and King Darius. It says that Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus. Now we're told, if you look at the footnote, it says essentially Darius, that is the reign of Cyrus. As far as I understand, they're actually the same one person, just different names. If I'm wrong about that, you can tell me, and I'm happy for that. But it's interesting because if you look at the book of Ezra chapter 1, which is on page 472, if you want to turn to it, but don't, if you, I'm going to read some of it out. Ezra chapter 1, and we find Cyrus, king of Persia. And it says, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm and also to put in writing. And essentially, this is a decree from this king to release those who are in exile. It says that his heart is moved, most likely through Daniel, through what's happened to Daniel, through what God has done. And the result of this, as in Ezra chapter 1, the people are brought up out of exile in Babylon and go back to Jerusalem. Daniel's faithful witness, God's deliverance, resulted in the people being brought out of exile. And I think this is a reminder to us today that through our faithful witness, through God's deliverance, through his Holy Spirit moving in the world, we will see people come from a place of exile from God to being brought home into a relationship with him. Because the way God works in us is not just about us. He wants people to be blessed through us by his Spirit. That's what we long to see. But also, as we close, you may have noticed some similarities between the story of Daniel chapter 6 and the story of Jesus. I'm going to tell you, I think I've got 8 different things. Firstly, in this story of Daniel, Daniel is falsely accused and found innocent. We think about the story of Jesus. He is falsely accused by these religious leaders who are jealous of him, who are threatened by him. And they find nothing against him. In Daniel, a law is made to catch him out. For Jesus, his words are used against him. They say Jesus said he would destroy the temple. Jesus said he is the Son of God. He's blaspheming. They said he was breaking the law and deserved to be killed. Both in Daniel and Jesus' story, we have a ruler who is reluctant to put these charges against them, but give in to pressure. In both stories, there is a stone put over the den and over the tomb. In both stories, there is a miraculous deliverance. We're told Daniel is lifted up, and Jesus rose from the dead in victory. Both were found alive in the morning at dawn. Both of whom's enemies are defeated. Jesus' resurrection, he triumphed over sin and death, defeating it. And in both cases, God is glorified. This story of Daniel is a foreshadowing of Jesus, what Jesus is going to do on the cross, what Jesus was going to do through his resurrection to eternal life. It is only through what Jesus has done that we are saved. I think it's a good thing to say that we are not Daniel and we are not Jesus. I'm struck that Daniel was someone who was seen as totally trustworthy, totally innocent. Nothing can be found against him. It was the same with Jesus. But sadly for us, that's not always true. We get things wrong. We mess up. But through Jesus, we find forgiveness, we find love, we find hope. Through him. And we can look to be like Daniel and like Jesus in the way we live, knowing that it is all about him and what he has done. Knowing that he gives us hope, even in the darkest valleys, even in the darkest dens we may find ourselves in. And also, it's a reminder that Jesus has been through that as well. Jesus was falsely accused. Jesus was beaten and battered. Jesus was hung on a cross, put in a tomb, a stone rolled over the entrance. He knows darkness, but he also knows life. Let's trust in him.